Well, thanks for joining us today. We are ready to get started with this exciting webinar. This is the first in a series that we're hoping to put out. We're talking about insecure by default, the hidden complexities of cloud security. This is quite a large topic. There are plenty of cloud providers out there, and they all have some settings that need to be checked out and some things of how you configure them that could lead to a lot of different complications. So thank you and for joining us, and we're glad you're here. Getting started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who TrustedSec is, and then we'll jump right into the content. We're a organization that has high-level talent with advanced tools to reach your security objectives. Originally founded in 2012 by David Kennedy, who is the cyber security expert and author of Metasploit, the Penetration Tester's Guide, along with many other places where he publicly speaks. We have over 80 cybersecurity consultants working in collaboration from our global headquarters here in Cleveland and all over the world. We definitely approach the business of security differently than others. And there's some statements here for you to take a look at. And we're a full service firm, so we can help you with design work, evaluation, hardening your environment, and even responding if there is an incident. I'm going to jump into the content right now. So again, my name is Paul Sems. I'm responsible for the security engineering and remediation team. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to have turn my video on so you can see what I look like, and each of our members will do that just for a second here. So hopefully you can see me. Hi, I'm Paul, and I'm going to hand it over to Mitch. Mitch, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Mitch Parrish. I work on the remediation team here at TrustedSec, helping folks harden their cloud and development environments, and looking forward to today's topic for sure.
Excellent. Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Berkland here at TrustedSec. I run the cloud penetration testing practice.
Edwin.
Hey, Edwin David. I'm a security consultant at TrustedSec, and I do all the Azure cloud penetration testing side of the house of cloud for TrustedSec.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to turn my video off with my cool glasses. So we'll go to the next screen here. Real quick, where does this play into this? Just so we're kind of aware, the activity we're talking about, we're going to be talking about exploring the cloud and all sorts of stuff. But I just wanted to show this real quick before we dive into the content. A lot of what we're talking about would be, doing the recommended hardening activities. On the big scheme of things, what we're looking at is, make sure you're reviewing your current configurations so that they're secure, actually securing them in pen testing. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion around where all of these activities go, but this is probably an appropriate order to review your configurations, make sure that you've reviewed them from a hardening perspective, do the actual activities, and then validate it. So that's just a high level of where these activities come into. So as we talk through each of these, you'll have some context of what we're talking about and some of these exciting examples here. Jumping into this, we are going to start looking at the wonderful world of Microsoft 365. Wow, that one is a doozy. There's quite a bit in there. So I'm going to hand that over to Edwin. Why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you, Paul. So this first section that we're going to be talking about is just some services around M365 that me as a consultant will start off with, and a lot of it resolves around user enumeration that largely goes undetected, and we'll be diving into just a brief overview with a couple different tools with two different Microsoft 365 services that we try and capitalize on with user enumeration, because that is one of the key aspects of trying to penetrate into a cloud environment, is trying to get as much much valid end users as possible for conducting things like weak password spraying, phishing operations, and so forth. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is Microsoft Teams. And what everybody is staring at on this webinar is really kind of the default setting in a M365 environment with Microsoft Teams. So it's a collaboration platform. Microsoft wants you to collaborate with everybody. So by default, all external domains are allowed, and external users that aren't managed by your own organizations can contact people can make contact with your organization that may not exist in your Azure environment. This is one of the biggest defaults that I'll typically find during a penetration test. And what I want to show you here is a product called Team Filtration. Originally, this was a internal trusted sec tool that got released out at DEF CON last year. We use it to enumerate valid accounts through Microsoft Teams. And what you're seeing right here is I'm using just basically a word list. You can add things such as data breach emails from like data breach collections and so forth. And what it'll do is it will systematically go through and see if there's any type of user accounts that are valid from a Microsoft Teams perspective. And Paul, if you're on the line listening, you can absolutely jump right in at any time.
I just wanted to add here. So, and this is the default setting. Obviously, this is our first default setting that we're calling out here. This setting here is by default to allow all external domains, which I don't know how many organizations really rely on that as part of their workflow. In my opinion, this is just way overly permissive. Because it's the default, and just anybody at any organization can reach out and talk to your people directly. It's kind of ridiculous that it's that is there by default, and that's why it's our number one, I think, coming into this.
Yeah, I think just real quick on that slide again, going back to that, this whole topic with a lot of the Microsoft products, they named their products Exchange, like exchanging ideas with everyone, Teams with everyone, sharing with everyone. SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, they're all named with this idea that by default, everyone can have access to everything, which is just ridiculous. So I'll let you keep going.
So aside from enumeration, this tool will do password spraying operations over Firefox that will rotate IP addresses as weak password spraying is occurring against any valid accounts. That's good to avoid things like Azure Smart Lockout, so you don't get detected as a malicious actor right out of the gate. Has word list capabilities. You can bring your own word lists. So if you have, let's say like census data of usernames or statistically likely usernames, that's another good word list. You can load that up in here, and it will proceed to see if it's a valid user account or not based upon this. Based upon these settings right here. Along with that, it does have Excel modules and interactive database capabilities. So you're keeping track of any type of weak passwords that you may land on against a standard user account. If Teams isn't an option, if it's locked down, if the customer is not using Microsoft Teams, there are other options. This is a fantastic way of doing user enumeration. This uses OneDrive for Business, and same type of identification, but different workload, where what OneDrive enumerate will do is it will go out to these public endpoints within the SharePoint environment. And what you're seeing here is just within my lab tenant where I am enumerating a handful of accounts that have OneDrive for Business enabled.
Now
yeah.
this one is in there, another default. It's one that's a little bit trickier to maybe to distance yourself from, because this default is the personal site creation in SharePoint, and it's on by default, obviously. It creates this URL that's enumerable then. So it's a default that's there. You can disable it if you'd like to, but you will lose that OneDrive, personal OneDrive functionality there.
So moving on past this workload, and one of the workloads that we really kind of encounter very frequently, and this next slide that I'm getting ready to show you is, I can just attest that it is some advanced persistent threat activity right here. And it is a data gold mine, not only for us when that initial access is gained, but one of the bigger issues is around Teams and SharePoint Online. And one of the things that I typically find is the instance where a public Teams channel is born in an environment. On the back end, it automatically creates a SharePoint site for that instance. So what you're seeing here on the right-hand portion of the screen is just me getting into that SharePoint workload and typing the simple term password. And SharePoint does a phenomenal job with indexing site data and files and what some of the data that is contained within those files. So like here, for example, I've created a public Teams channel called information security in my lab environment. But, you know, taking a step back, this is probably indicative of some of the basic operations of what a normal enterprise would be doing. And so somebody from the information security department may go out there and they may start storing confidential documents out there that maybe they don't want public, or possibly putting in a repository of passwords. Excel is a really big one that I'll normally do, and I'll search on where basically plain text passwords are stored. OneNote is another really big one where people will store shared OneNotes of doing different type of operations within the confines of their department, and they'll put it out here. And one of the things that I think some enterprises are taken back on is once a public Teams channel is made, any authenticated user has access to that data on the back end. So that's one of the things that's one of the problems that this sort of issue just kind of creates. And then it starts becoming a data goldmine for an attacker, because initially we're not looking for somebody with like global admin. We're looking for somebody that's using a weak password that can either be phished, or maybe they have a weak form of MFA. And once we're in, this is literally probably the first workload that I'll pivot to. And this is a excellent privilege escalation tactic. If passwords to other Azure systems, or even M365 passwords that are stored, it's a very excellent pivot off point from there.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that that's all of that is exposed, and people don't even really know that. It's not like there's a big flashing sign that says, hey, what you just did, you put it in a very insecure way. I mean, just the idea that storing passwords in the clear text is not good, but even if it wasn't passwords, other stuff that you would have this expectation of privacy, it just doesn't exist in a lot of these situations.
And along with that, I found VPN certs for sure that have enabled me to jump into on-premises off of their SharePoint files. So yeah, just there's a lot of stuff that can be out there.
Yeah, and even process documents and how to reset a password, it gives you like, oh, hey, here's the person I need to call. So excellent. Let's keep
The last point I was really going to make about this, depending on your conditional access policies too, and especially with remote work, it is very, very easy to gain access to a SharePoint Online environment from an untrusted device.
Absolutely. In fact, they make it that way to do it, so that anyone can access it. Oops.
No, you're fine.
Right.
So the next thing I want to talk about is just really just not all doom and gloom, just really kind of some best remediation practices that I recommend around M365 workloads. And it really kind of encompasses more than just Office, Exchange Online, that sort of thing. It can pivot over into your Intune environment. This is like an example of Microsoft Secure Score that I have that's given me some Intune recommendations. It'll do the breakdown points between identity, data, and devices. So this is a really, really good starting point if you want to shore up some of either a default or weaknesses in your environment to kind of prevent some of these things from happening. As far as specifically sensitive data entry points such as SharePoint Online or Exchange Online, those are really kind of two good workloads that have a lot of sensitive data in it. And if you haven't had a chance, there is a area inside of conditional access in Azure that has basically, it's in preview right now, but it's built out of the box templates. And one of the templates is around for remote work and using app enforced restrictions. There's a lot of detail that I'm not really going to go into on here, but I've really kind of given the highlights on the slide deck. It does require some planning to do. But this is probably one of the policies that I don't see really kind of enough of between this and enforcing hybrid Azure AD joins, so that you're making it more difficult for attackers to get to some of these sensitive data workloads off-prem.
Perfect. Yeah, that's definitely one that we want to deep dive into, and definitely would be a follow-up because of the examples. I've seen some of your work there, and it's quite amazing. Very good.
And the last thing I can't mention enough with securing M365 is deploying MFA everywhere. And just a reminder that MFA is not built the same between you're really kind of your different options. And over here on the right side of the screen, these are some of the MFA options on what I consider, maybe not so secure, better MFA methods that you probably want to have your users registering to, and then really kind of your most secure phishing resistant MFA methods. Those are probably really more reserved for people with privileged access roles, such as like global admin, user admin, administrator, so forth.
And that's it. Talking about the insecure by default, it's pretty amazing that the things you just talked about, the conditional access policies, and even some of the, they're just not available unless you're in the higher licensing. So by default, if you just get started and don't buy the right licenses, you might not even have access to some of that in the Microsoft 365 environment.
Exactly. And one of the things I called out here was phone calls, because even though Microsoft has fixed the push notifications issue around Microsoft Authenticator, where now they just default over to number matching if you're set up to be Microsoft managed with your MFA program. But phone calls can still be a rough issue because if a weak password is gained, the threat actor can just go ahead and send a call to the phone, and it's still pretty generic where they just hit that pound key if they want to accept. So that still does present some opportunity to do an MFA fatigue attack if that type of MFA, if that is like the default MFA registration for an account.
Absolutely. Very good.
So continuing on,
Yep.
Exploring Azure defaults, and and Paul's going to jump in here too. as
Real
I
quick,
go through
actually,
some of these. Yeah,
I
go
just
on,
want
Paul.
to I just want to address something here because people might have a little bit of confusion over what is M365 versus Azure, right? Like where do they draw the line, right? Because there is a bit of overlap there. So the M365 services are the software as a services suite of software that, whereas Azure would be everything else, I would say, is an easy way to explain it. So just wanted to kind of share where the delineation, what M365 encompasses versus Azure, generally speaking.
Yeah, that overlap is definitely confusing because we get requests to say, oh yeah, we use Azure. What they mean is they use Azure AD. They're not actually
Right.
doing the
On the
other
back
thing.
end for the M365.
Exactly. Yeah, good call out there. All right, let's go to the next slide. Excellent.
So one of the first topics that we're going to be diving out into is just really kind of defaults or possible misconfigurations that can be made to Azure Active Directory Connect. And one of the first things that you have the ability to do whenever you're installing Azure AD Connect for the first time is syncing your users and what kind of options you want to do there. And whenever you get to your domain/OU filtering section, by default, Azure Active Directory Connect just says, hey, do you want to sync all domains and your OUs? So if this button right here is pushed, then basically all of your service accounts, groups, users is automatically synced out to the cloud. And there's some things to take into consideration there once that's done, because they're not just automatically enrolled into MFA. Every person that is synced out there is going to have to go through some type of registration process. One of the bigger issues is probably service accounts. Those will get synced out there as well, and maybe half of them or 90% of those types of service accounts may have nothing to do with any type of Azure Active Directory authentication, but they're out there. And service accounts are obviously not typically backed with MFA. So you're really introducing a lot of risk when this is kind of done for the first time, because now you have to have an MFA plan to get everybody secured, and making sure that you have the right conditional access policies to make sure that those accounts are getting secured.
I'm going to jump in on that one real quick. This same pretty much unlimited syncing is also part of the newer release of the Azure AD Connect, the Cloud Sync one too. So by default, it offers, hey, sync your entire directory, which is a bit challenging also. So it's not going away.
And to hop on there, also with that MFA registration, that's such a big thing where I think it's a big blind spot where people think, oh, well, we've got MFA enabled, right? It's through conditional access. And they don't realize that the registration component needs to be fulfilled before it works, and that anybody can register it by default there. So, I mean, that's been a huge way of gaining access. And now you have MFA access even, so it's perfect if it hasn't been registered yet. So yeah, definitely an issue there.
So the other thing to kind of tie onto that, when those users are gone out there for the first time, this is a default in Azure Active Directory where access is not restricted in the environment. If you turn that on, then access is restricted to people with the administrative, like RBAC privileges. But by default, any user can actually go out to Azure Active Directory and see all the users, groups, people that have privileged roles. You can't see conditional access, but I'll be going into that here on the next slide on how that can even be enumerated from an end user perspective. So when you have something like this, what can happen next can be very, very, I don't want to say disastrous, but it can definitely aid a threat actor into getting a lot of intelligence back around around your Azure Active Directory. And I believe we may have a question in the Q&A area. Paul, did you want to bring that up now?
It just what we don't have to bring it up right now. I just want to make sure everyone is aware. Sorry,
Okay.
that we do have some there that we should probably jump on when we get a break.
Very sorry.
No, all good.
So anyway, what you're seeing here on the left-hand side, and you've may have heard about, hey, somebody had their access token stolen, or I've gotten phished, and now somebody has gained access into my Azure environment. I don't know what exactly is going on. So what you're seeing here is the exact same thing that a threat actor would do. I have stolen a token for a generic user that has no privileges into Azure Active Directory. And I've taken their token and I've used the tool called Road Recon. And once it gathers all that information on the left-hand side, not only now do I have the conditional access policies in the target tenant, I've now exfilled all of the users in the environment, the groups, service principals, even down to people with privileged RBAC roles. So now you have valid information, and possibly if you're doing any type of phishing operations, you now know who to target that has some expanded access into Azure. So that's where this becomes really kind of a heavier problem if one of your end users is compromised. So on the back end, this is using a lot of like Azure PowerShell. So even if the administration portal is restricted on the GUI, it is not restricted through PowerShell. So you can still get this kind of information on the back end. And there's other methods of limiting that type of access too. But the main point of this slide is just showing how powerful it is on an attack on just a standard end user, and what type of information that they can get out of your Azure Active Directory environment very quickly. So I have a very small tenant, but even on larger ones, this process may just take maybe a couple minutes at most, and that's all it takes before a threat actor has this type of information.
Pretty amazing how much is available there.
So the next thing that I want to talk about is Azure Active Directory guests. This is just kind of another default in Azure AD, where anybody in the company can invite an external guest into their Azure AD environment. That's kind of done for a lot of different reasons. Maybe people need to collaborate externally with a third party like vendor and so forth through like Microsoft Teams, for instance. That's probably one of the more common ones on why people need to invite guests. But anyone can do it. So that's a really good way for a threat actor that can gain kind of some persistence in the environment, even though it's a little bit limited, depending on how this top section around guest user access restrictions is configured. Luckily, by default there, your default access is around your own directory object in Azure. So meaning if I guess I could say an uninvited guest comes into your environment, all that they can enumerate is really kind of themselves, unless some type of escalation is done where now they either have access to an internal app, or they're able to gain access to a directory role, because it is possible for a guest to be added to a directory role in an Azure AD tenant that they don't belong to. So kind of the other issue along there is sometimes I typically don't find guests are enrolled into MFA into the target tenant. That is something that conditional access can take care of for you. But by default, once a guest is invited, they aren't automatically enrolled into MFA unless you have some conditional access policies around that type of scenario. So that brings in a third-party risk as well. So I just want to talk about briefly about impersonating users out into the Azure cloud. And this is something for probably a future webinar. because the attack chain is really absolutely amazing. I've wrote a blog about how this is really kind of done. And this is the Azure Active Directory Connect setting right here, which is to enable single sign-on for corporate desktop users. There's literally no warning about what this kind of does and what it does on the back end, and unless you click on to learn more about it. But high level, this creates a machine account in your Active Directory environment, and if that machine account NTLM hash is ever compromised, then that becomes a severe issue where any Active Directory synced user out in the cloud can be impersonated through that NTLM hash, with the only exception that MFA does mitigate some of those things, but there are other accounts like service accounts that open up a lot of risk for that type of issue. But I'm not going to deep dive into this one. I'm just going to go ahead and carry on to the next slide.
That one's definitely one we'd definitely want to do a full webinar just on this topic. It's excellent.
Yeah, it's an extremely fascinating attack chain. This is one tool that I use very frequently just to recon Azure environments. You can do it as an outsider, so you can gain what the tenant ID is. If this previous setting here is enabled, I get that as well. If the tenant is running like a Microsoft Defender for Identity instance, you're going to get that information too, where now you know that you may need to be a little bit more careful if you're trying to prevent an alert from getting triggered. But this is the type of stuff that you can pull back completely unauthenticated from the cloud environment. So one of the last things I really kind of wanted to talk about really with all this, and one of the big things that really kind of stops some of these attack chains within Azure is if an enterprise is doing hybrid Azure AD join, which is obviously an option in Azure Active Directory Connect. There are other options if you don't want to hit that button and do it all at the same time. There's ways where you can do this through like group policy objects by manipulating the registry if you only want to test like a handful of computer accounts first before you do hybrid Azure AD join. But that is doing hybrid Azure AD join from an Azure from a conditional access perspective drastically reduces your threat surface from an unauthenticated perspective, where if somebody is trying to log in from like a device that isn't or what I want to say is probably untrusted, like a home desktop, maybe someone's conducting a penetration test from the outside. This is a major roadblock for somebody because now they realize that even though they've been trying to break in from an untrusted device, maybe they've actually compromised a user with a weak password, but then they can't access any of the cloud workloads to pivot further into the environment because hybrid Azure AD join is enforced. Absolutely. So, good. And that provides SSO options as well. So I did want to bring that up, that desktop SSO isn't your only thing. If you do a hybrid Azure AD join, that gives you single sign-on capability as well, without the extra added dangers that desktop SSO does.
Excellent. Very good. So I am looking at the time here. I want to make sure we have enough time because there's some AWS items we want to jump on, and we want to have a little bit of story time and answers for Q&A. Before we jump over there, though, there were some quick questions that I think we should address. I can address the one where AD Connect was already synced with everything. Is it a manual cleanup, or can we adjust that? It definitely can be adjusted afterwards. And we do quite a bit of that with our remediation and hardening team. We work through, we take a look and analyze that. And then what happens is when you make those changes, it will disable the accounts and help with the cleanup. But there's always going to be some PowerShell that's needed to help clean that up. Are most service accounts never signed on with? That is correct. They shouldn't be signed on with. But that's part of the problem is if you have like a SQL admin account or a SQL user account that happens to have a bad credentials or weak credentials, they could definitely be exploited, or maybe that's publicly exposed because your website is exposing those as configuration files or something to that extent. So those are the answers to the questions that we had there. And Edwin, is there anything else you wanted to wrap up on Azure right now before we jump into the AWS topics?
No, I think the only one that I wanted to bring up is obviously I think we're going to be skipping some slides around
Just a little.
Conditional access. So this is probably one of the major ones that we see right here is if somebody is doing conditional access by device filtering, please go through and review those. Linux was an option that was added, I think, late last year, because it used to never be an option. You'd only see like Windows or Mac OS. And on several occasions, I've been able to bypass conditional access policies because that setting had been missed. So I'll go ahead and get to the AWS side.
I think so. We're going to jump. Oh, you know what? Actually, there's a good transition slide there. If we go back, remembering this one right there. So this is a problem that is a problem on both platforms. And this is a great way for us to transition. So I'll talk to this one and then we'll hand it over to Mitch. But when you create a new virtual machine, just go to Azure and you're like, hey, I'm going to create a new VM. The default allow RDP is still an option. It does warn you, but it's kind of crazy that it opens up those ports by default. It does warn people not to do that, but again, it's still there. At least they added the warning. And with that, I think we have some similar problems over on AWS that we'll get to. So thank you, Edwin, on that. And Mitch, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. I'll let this title slide kind of speak to itself. I think everyone that's touched AWS can relate to that. So jumping right in, I just want to quickly cover some AWS default configurations. I think a lot of organizations make a lot of assumptions when they're migrating to the platform. So I think a good place to start is kind of taking a look at the shared responsibility model. Typically, folks migrate their workloads over to AWS or any cloud provider to kind of offload that kind of management overhead, and that's great. Gives you more time to build your product or your application or provide services to your clients. But when it comes to security, it's vital to know exactly where AWS draws that line and to not make any assumptions about the default configurations. So on that note, on this slide, I kind of just wanted to show where you start out in AWS. This is a scan by Prowler. It's a great open source security tool. These are the results of a scan against a brand new AWS account. So this is basically your starting point when you open an account. You can see right off the bat, you've got some considerable remediation work ahead of you. A lot of these findings do come from services that haven't been enabled or configured, including some that most would consider fairly vital: CloudTrail event history, VPC flow logs, and then some additional findings enabling encryption at rest across all data services, and then some of the default networking resources that AWS creates for you, whether you ask for it or not. And we'll talk about that in a future slide. But just knowing, like, right out of the bat, you've got a decent amount of work to put into to get to a good spot. Wanted to start here with a few issues that we kind of repeatedly see when we get into a client's environment to perform hardening reviews. The first is almost always MFA enforcement, because AWS does I would say, a terrible job at making it easy or intuitive for people. First and foremost, the root user, the highest privilege user across any AWS account. By default, no MFA is enforced. There's no sort of notification. They have added a flag to the IAM homepage finally. And then until a few months ago, you couldn't even register more than one MFA device. So that kind of made managing that root user a hassle, especially in remote first workforces. For accounts that are created through AWS organizations, the root user itself is kind of abstracted. You don't see any mention of it while you're doing that. It's up to you to go in with the email address that you selected and kind of go through the password reset process and then enabling MFA. So super easy to forget. We see a lot of folks, they'll have root MFA on their management account and a couple other accounts. And then as their organization grows, we see member accounts that lack that protection. So kind of indicative that people, create those accounts and just forget. For IAM users, it's even more painful. AWS's own documentation, I think it's like 22 steps.
Wow.
For configuring MFA for users. I originally was going to show an example policy for requiring MFA and then allowing users to manage their own devices, but it wouldn't fit on a single slide. So that kind of tells you the complexity for enforcing MFA and where a lot of folks can go wrong and misconfigure that. Additionally, like I said, it's pretty granular. It has to be attached to users and groups. And then you do have to remember to put in those allow exceptions to allow users to manage their own MFA devices, as well as reset their own passwords. That's kind of the good and bad of AWS is it's infinitely configurable. So you have to, one, know how to do it, and two, know that you need to do it to begin with. So super easy to misconfigure. Once you get an organization set up, there is no centralized auditing across accounts in an organization as far as user MFA goes. We always recommend using role assumption and not relying on IAM users. But for those users that are necessary in individual accounts, there's no cross-account auditing of MFA. AWS itself has been fairly behind the curve on FIDO integration. A fairly recent addition. And then if you're trying to use the API or CLI based requests, it's even more of a hassle. There's really no native way built into the CLI to use MFA. And then FIDO based MFA is not even supported yet. So things to consider there. So I mentioned earlier kind of the default networking resources that are created. When you open up an account, Amazon right out of the bat creates VPCs in 17 regions, each with their own resources. So instead of giving you what you want, they give you everything, and then you get the fun task of cleaning it up. If anybody's running workloads in 17 regions with a single account, we would need a much longer webinar to go over those issues. So why is this bad? First, obviously, the increased attack surface. There's no built-in monitoring of any of these regions or VPCs that are created. It's kind of the Wild West out there. You've got no idea what's being built or what's accessing these networks. So that's naturally leads to an increased monitoring effort. And if you use AWS's built-in security services like config, that's going to you're going to see a dramatic increase in cost. Config across multiple regions, the cost gets out of hand super, super quick. So what do we do to kind of alleviate this? It leads back to our initial Prowler findings that we talked about. There's just a lot to remediate before you can even get started building or migrating anything. Kind of show you some of these default settings. This is where Paul was talking about the default rules, inbound rules for Azure VMs, very much the same thing on EC2 with wide open security group roles, network ACLs. The security groups themselves you can't delete unless you delete the entire VPC itself. It's used as a fallback for compute resources unless you've created additional security groups. So because of that fact, we always recommend removing all inbound and outbound rules on default security groups and then just not using them. That way, in case someone creates a resource and gets to select a security group, it'll just fail safe to deny all. For the network ACLs, they're a great second line of defense for security groups. At a minimum, we recommend putting in deny rules for management port access, at least until you have an idea of what services are going to be needing access to your VPCs. So the recommendation here for kind of dealing with these insecure defaults on the network resource side, there's a couple open source tools out there, Cloud Nuke being one. It goes up, you open an account, you can run this tool against it, and it'll just nuke and delete all of these unnecessary things. And then you can kind of really start from scratch and build things with intention with only the rules that you want. On top of that, if you're running AWS organizations, always put in a service control policy at the root level that defines your operating regions. And that will kind of negate a bunch of these default services that you don't want. It'll prevent people from creating resources, modifying resources or anything at all. It's essentially a short to remediating AWS's lack of the ability to explicitly disable regions. So service control policy is super powerful, and we always recommend those. Second, and real quick, I know we're running out of time. The instance metadata service version 1, always a popular one. IMDS essentially allows an instance to retrieve information about itself, including the credentials if an IAM instance profile is attached. So attackers will look for applications with a SSRF vulnerability running on EC2. And if IMDS version 1 is enabled, they'll essentially be able to call that API and get IAM credentials back. So super critical one, change it to version 2 if you've got existing EC2s. Make sure it defaults to IMDS version 1 when you're creating them. So in your IAC templates or your profiles or anything like that, make sure IMDS version 2 is selected. Otherwise, like I said, it's just going to default to version 1 and leave you vulnerable to that. And I think, yeah, so here's a quick example of just making a request to that instance metadata service endpoint. With the instance profile, you're able to get that access token back pretty easily.
Interesting.
Yeah, so then you can go use those credentials against AWS, for whatever permissions that instance has, permissions for, you can
So Mitch, I have a couple questions for you here. So if we're looking at AWS, right, this is not just a Microsoft insecure by default issue. It's across different platforms. And just touch on it. Have you seen similar? I know you've had the ability to work on other platforms too, GCP and I'm just throwing this out there, and the Ali Cloud stuff, Alibaba Cloud. Similar type of concerns across those? We don't have to go into the details, but just in general.
Yeah, I would say especially on Alibaba, if anyone's running there, they're a few years behind AWS and largely a clone. So most of these issues pop up there as well. This one, in fact, the instance metadata service was talking with someone this morning on our team about how a similar vulnerability exists in Azure. So yeah, a lot of these vulnerabilities exist across all of them.
So recommending some, reviewing the configuration, if you're not in it every day, that's definitely something people should be looking at, is like, let's actually harden this before we get to pen testing, right? I mean, that's a huge thing that people should be doing. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to Paul. So I think your slide is on the next one here. So we talked a little bit about some of these default settings. We talked about using, we should harden the environment beforehand. But then let's actually take a look here, Paul. I'm going to hand it over to you about some of the exciting things that are on the default attack chains here. So I'll hand it over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, I mean, we chose this topic because we use these insecure defaults all the time when we're doing testing. So these insecure defaults are being used up by attackers and testers. And the thing about them is that they're the defaults, right? So if you're not really diving into the weeds of it all, you might not know that these defaults are insecure. You might assume that, oh, they must, set this up in a secure manner or in a more secure manner. But if you don't actually dive in there, you might not even know that. And so these settings are really common because of that. There's just across the organizations, you see these settings still in place. Because I think just a lot of people don't know. So I want to show you kind of how these attacks are used with some context to kind of give you an idea about how they might facilitate an attack chain. So with that, let's hop in here. So let's talk about recon first. We have a couple of ways that we can do recon. We can do OneDrive enumeration or Teams enumeration. I'm speaking specifically about types that pertain to what we're talking about today with the defaults. There are other enumeration methods like with Graph, but it's just because that's it, verbose error messages, and Microsoft doesn't consider user enumeration to be a vulnerability. So at any rate, we start out with some recon. We're going to find users with OneDrive enumeration or Teams enumeration. We can even determine if they're online or not with the external access enabled by default. So you can see if they're online. You can also see their out of office messages. So that's useful. And this is all from an external perspective. As far as I have my own tenant set up, I can now query users and see if they're available offline. I can see if they're out of office. I can even determine if they're on their mobile device or if they're on their desktop just by querying Microsoft services for the remote presence status. Now, this is useful, if you're doing red teaming, you might use this because you might wait for somebody to be out of office and then spoof a message from them saying, I'm having trouble reaching something. That type of thing. So the initial recon is one area. The next area here we're going to talk about our footholds then. So once we do our recon, we have user lists. Let's say I identified a bunch of users. I might try doing password sprays. And if you don't have that write back enforcement, it's one that we kind of skipped over. There's an Azure AD, you can enforce write back that doesn't allow weak passwords. You would be amazed at how many times password has gotten synced up into Azure. And you might not even think to spray password because you're like, oh, this obviously is going to be banned, but it got synced up there. So it exists. And if we get that.
Just real quick, that is the default. That what you just mentioned, again, it's a default. There's mechanisms to enable that password protection, but by default, it's disabled. It's crazy.
Yep. I mean, and it's one of those things where you say, you always hear, oh, Azure, has some banned word lists and whatever, and you expect it to be enforced by default, but it's not. And so that leads to another aspect of that is conditional access. So we've gotten a password, let's say we have 1,000 users, we sprayed it for the top 80 passwords, and we got a handful of them. We were able to, log in because they have no conditional access configured by default. Otherwise, we might do something like Teams phishing, because I can message users directly now at an organization. And having done this in the past, it's actually kind of an interesting phishing experience because a lot of times you phish, you send messages and you wait. But with this, you can get feedback directly. And sometimes it's awesome and they go along with it, and you'll go back and forth. Like, for instance, I'll set up an IT help desk with a fake domain and I'll phish them that way and just say, oh, I need you to apply this patch that wasn't able to run on your laptop. The downside of that is that you also have some very real interactions when people realize that you're a fake and they may not be very kind to you. So it's a different experience. But anyway, at any rate, Teams phishing, it might land you with a shell, which has nothing to do with defaults really, or it might land you with credentials, in which case, sorry, here, get a couple slides. Oh, hey, Paul, can you, there we go. Oh, here we go. Thanks. All right, great. So yeah, you might get credentials and then you're back to the conditional access aspect there. Moving on from there, let's talk about internal recon and persistence. Once we've bypassed that conditional access and we have our foothold, the first thing that we're going to do is going to grab a full users list, from the Azure portal. So it's not restricted by default. So we're going to jump in there, download also a group list, and we can get group membership, etc. Find those high value accounts that we want. From there, so with that full user list, we're going to do more password sprays, because think about it. If you have a large organization, how many of you out there are secure in your knowledge that not a single account, if you had a full user list, would not have a bad password assigned to it? So almost everywhere, there's going to be at least one. It might be something that they forgot about that was there. So from this user list, you can do things like doing spear phishing, or you can do something like starting some persistence via registering an application. The registering of an application is allowed by default, so you can assign some credentials to that, give it some access of yours, and then you'll be able to hang on to some access if your user account gets burned. From there, you can also do some persistence with a guest invite, which is also allowed by default, where all users are allowed to invite guests. It's not as good of a foothold, but it still lets you connect to them, see what assets are there, get user lists and group membership, etc. You might not have very much access depending on how they have it set up, but hey, who knows? They might have some cool dynamic group memberships for guests that you can be part of. At any rate, the real thing that's kind of tricky here is that you can do application phishing much better now, because so once you have a foothold in an environment, you can register a single tenant application. And without getting too technical, it's just saying that there are two types of applications: multi-tenant, which means that I can invite you from my organization, or single tenant, which means it's only inside of your organization. Single tenant applications are allowed a bit more leeway with what they're able to access as far as resources go. They might be allowed to read your email without admin consent. Things like that. So if an attacker can get in and register an application, they can then turn around and phish users to that application, and then be able to steal access keys to reach out with that via OAuth. So I mean, these all combine here to give an attacker various ways that they can expand. These are just some of the ones that pertain to what we're talking about today. So I mean, all of these are very actionable, and they're used, and they can be used. So it's not like this is just some hypothetical, oh, these are bad defaults that you should fix, like an SSL finding, right? Like this is something that is real, that we use all the time. So that's actually my last slide there. So does anybody have any questions about any of this? So I see example applications. So you can register your own application. What you do is you set up like a PHP page on your web server that'll accept a callback, and then you set it up inside of Azure AD with the application with the callback pointing to your PHP page. If you want to do it, there's actually a blog I wrote on it a little while back. It's a really simple version. We're just basically taking somebody's perfectly valid and not malicious code, and we're just modifying it and using it for our own nefarious ends. So I'll find that blog real quick and I'll pop that into chat. But yeah, so are there any other questions there?
So I think if we have time, we have some people sticking around. If there are some more questions, that would be great. I think we also wanted to maybe talk about some real world examples of using this. I know you kind of went into one, but maybe can someone give us a quick story, and then we'll wrap for the. Anyone want to give us a story?
I can just pop in here. I mean, these attack paths, I mean, not to be a boring host, but these attack paths are all exactly what we do all the time. So I mean, like, these are not hypothetical. These we've definitely done all of these here. So I mean, yeah, with that, there's not much more information I can give as far as specifics go, except for that. Yeah. So I mean,
this is how these are the stories, right? So
yeah, we enumerate users. Once we have a user list, we'll do password sprays. We'll do 80 password sprays in a week, because that gives us an hour between password sprays, and you can get through a lot of passwords in that time. So once we get there, we find it, accounts that don't have MFA, or we would spam it in the past. And from there, get internal SharePoint, finding things there. Or if you have access, whatever you have read access to with your account, maybe Logic apps or whatnot with credentials stored in. But yeah, these default ones specifically are all real world ones that we have definitely used, and that we use regularly. So,
perfect.
I don't know if anybody else had anything to add there.
Yeah, if anyone else wants to jump in. Okay. Well, with that, everyone, thank you guys so much for joining us. We really had a good time here talking about it. We're going to have some follow-up webinars that maybe dive deeper into each of these. If you're interested in that, let us know. We're on all the major social medias, so please interact with us. Twitter, LinkedIn, Discord. Go ahead and, get a hold of us and let us know what you'd like. We have this, things that are available. So please let us know, and we will try to go ahead and add more things, topics on this exciting topic of cloud security, and a lot of things are insecure by default. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.